And then he started fighting me. So I was trying to push him out the door. Couldn't. He had a knife, he was waving it around. Trengrove. So his full name is Jordan Trengrove, yeah?
I don't think she has any remorse. I looked back a few times while the judge was speaking and there was just no remorse shown, so I don't think there's any there. Well, I've tried ending my life over it. I've had a bond with my son. I've not been able to leave the house. I've not been able to go to work, so it's just, now I know she's locked away for a bit longer, it's just a bit of a relief, but I wish it was longer a sentence.
It was a cold morning in May 2020 when a dog walker, taking their very usual route through the quiet fields of Barrow in Furness, stumbled across a horrifying scene. There, lying in the damp grass, was a young woman. Her face was swollen. She had one eye that was completely closed from bruising, and her body was covered in cuts and bruises. There was blood that was dried on her skin. And when the dog walker looked closer, they could see that her clothes were completely torn and her entire appearance seemed the scene of suffering and brutality. She was disorientated. She was barely able to move, and so the dog walker rushed off and went to get help. Calling after him, he could hear 2 words: "Help me." The authorities were called immediately. Paramedics arrived and they carefully lifted this woman onto the stretcher as she whispered her shocking account. Through tears, she told them that she had been abducted, kidnapped, forced into this car by a group of men and taken to an unknown location where, once she was there, she had been raped, she had been beaten, and she'd been tortured for hours. She told them that the people who had done this to her were local businessmen, men that she knew, men of Asian descent who owned restaurants and shops throughout the town of Barrow. She told officers that these men were part of a grooming gang, one that had been operating in the shadows for years, preying on young girls like herself. She had managed to escape, she said, only to be dumped in the field and left for dead. Her name was Eleanor Williams. By the time she arrived at the hospital, Eleanor decided that she wasn't going to wait for the investigation. She took matters into her own hands. That same day, still lying in the hospital bed, she posted photos of her injuries up to Facebook. Her face was barely recognisable under all the bruises, and I have seen these photos. I'll put them up here, but basically one of her eyes is completely shut, as you'll be able to see. It is swollen shut. It looks incredibly painful, and it's actually quite shocking to see. I did this episode for the podcast a few weeks ago, and I was just trying to describe it in a way that I think you can only really understand it if you see the photos. Alongside the images, Eleanor wrote out a really chilling post where she detailed exactly what had happened to her. She spoke about the men who had taken her, the repeated assaults, and the fear that she'd lived with for years, because this wasn't a one-off thing. This had been happening to her for a long time. She named her abusers outright, accusing them of running this trafficking ring right in the heart of Barrow. And within hours, unsurprisingly, that post went viral. Hundreds of thousands of people shared it. Strangers, people who didn't even know Eleanor, were deeply affected by her words and by these pictures, these horrific images they were seeing. A young woman who had endured years of unimaginable abuse. The town erupted in outrage. How had this been allowed to happen? How had the police failed to stop it? Now, as her story spread, of course, so did the anger. The town was seething. Businesses named in her accusations saw their windows smashed, protesters took to the streets, and hate crimes against Barrow's Asian community skyrocketed. The public reaction was immediate and it was explosive. In a country that was still reeling from the grooming scandals in places like Rotherham and Rochdale, Eleanor's case really struck a nerve. Protesters took to the streets and they were pretty furious that police hadn't yet arrested anyone. Racial tensions ignited and death threats flooded social media. A crowdfunding campaign was set up and it actually managed to raise £22,000 to bring Eleanor's abusers to justice. The media really latched on to this case. Now, amid this turmoil, Tommy Robinson, who is the leader of the English Defence League, He's known for his really far-right activism and anti-Muslim rhetoric. He announced his intention to visit Barrow and kind of investigate Eleanor's claims. Despite requests from Eleanor's family to stay away, he decided to come anyway. Unsurprisingly, his presence in the town really amplified tensions, and it led to demonstrations and a real palpable sense of unrest among the residents. Now, sadly for Eleanor, she had not had this as her first kind of incident. She had accused multiple men of different crimes over the last few years. First, a man called Jordan, who she claimed had raped her multiple times. Now, I'll come back to that in a little bit. Then after that, she spoke about a local businessman, Mohammed. Eleanor told police that when she was younger, she would go to parties, like house parties, and when she was there would be older men. She said while she was there one day, she was introduced to a man known as Rami. She was 12 years old, and later on she would end up working at his Indian restaurant. Rami, we now know, was this local business owner called Mohammed. Eleanor stated that he started grooming her. He told her that he loved her, that she was special, and because of that, Eleanor began to think of herself as his girlfriend.
The cameras are out of crime, no silly.
What we come to talk about today. I was young, stupid. It used to probably made me think that I was his girlfriend for a long, long time.
Eleanor claimed Mohammed began this sexual relationship with her when she was 12 or 13 years old, grooming her to have sex with him. And she then went on to say that Mohammed had multiple friends that he had begged her to have sex with too. He told her that she would be doing him a, quote, massive favour. She explained that Mohammed would get money anytime she had sex with friends of his. And that's when she said that in 2018, Mohammed had made her go to Amsterdam, where she had been forced to work in a kind of brothel where she was sold for 25,000 euros. It was at a kind of auction, and the only reason she wasn't taken after being sold was because the buyer hadn't completed the deal. She also described how Mohammed had taken her to Ibiza for 2 weeks, where she was forced into working in a brothel again. Police arrested Mohammed and they interviewed him. Now, obviously, he denied all of the offences. He said that he didn't even know Eleanor. He'd never even been to any of the places that she had spoken about. Now, after 36 hours in police custody, he was released on bail. Now, after this, a major investigations unit was set up to look into the allegations that Eleanor had made. And the allegations kept coming. More men, more locations, more horror. She had names, dates, locations. She remembered everything in really vivid detail. But there was just one problem. When detectives started trying to look into the claims to verify them, they quickly realised that things weren't adding up. One of the allegations she made was that in June of 2019, she'd been getting text messages on her phone, and they said she needed to get a train to Blackpool. Police hoped that given how much detail Eleanor had given about the addresses in Blackpool, that the whole investigation would be opened up by this one piece of evidence. Eleanor was taken by police car to Blackpool in the hope that she could point out some of these locations. As they drove along, Eleanor pointed out vague locations and sort of spoke about what had happened, including getting into one car or walking. Now, one of the officers that had driven Eleanor to Blackpool that day was quite surprised that she was able to give some information, but she wasn't able to provide details in relation to the addresses. And so that officer hoped that by driving around the Blackpool area, they might go past somewhere that might jog her memory a bit. He later stated, though, that when they were in the car, he was a little bit confused that she didn't really display any emotion. At no point did she get upset when they were in the car. Now, of course, everyone reacts to trauma differently, and so he didn't think too much of it. But looking back, he thought it was actually a bit odd. And by the end of that day driving around Blackpool, police had no new leads into their investigation. At one point during this investigation, Eleanor went missing. Now, because she was considered a high-risk missing person, the police had authority to conduct checks on her mobile phone in relation to telephone masts that it would have been connecting to. This led police trawling through accommodation in the Blackpool area where she had been seen. 50 venues were visited, including pubs, hotels, B&Bs. And the final venue that they went to, the Savoy Hotel, police asked the receptionist about Eleanor. They showed her a picture of her. And the receptionist said that yes, actually, Eleanor had visited the hotel on the 30th of June 2019. Police uncovered that Eleanor had made this booking at the hotel on booking.com 2 days before she went there. They found that she arrived at the hotel at 8:20 and CCTV tracks her arriving on her own, checking in, and then going to her room. After staying in the room for about an hour, she was seen again on CCTV, this time leaving the hotel and going to a nearby supermarket. The literal CCTV footage did not match what Eleanor had told the police was happening around that time. Originally, she said that she had been being driven around various locations in Blackpool, being forced to have sex. Police continued watching this CCTV footage, and they saw that after she left the local shops, she returned to the Savoy Hotel. Now, the door of that hotel room had digital key access, very common nowadays. That showed that she had not opened that door, it had not been accessed in 24 hours. So she'd stayed inside, no one had joined her, and no one had been in that hotel room apart from her. Police realised in this moment what they had started to suspect, or some of them had started to suspect for some time. Eleanor had been lying about what had occurred. Now, an inquiry team was sent door to door to speak to girls that she had alleged had been at these parties that she was at. The ones where she'd been a victim of sexual exploitation, and she said that these girls had been victims too. Not one of those girls was found to have been a victim. When the girls and their parents were spoken to, they were just completely shocked at these accusations, and they said that nothing like that had ever happened to them. Now, Eleanor had also said, of course, that she'd been trafficked to Amsterdam by Mohammed, but police checked some of those records and they showed that at the exact time of the alleged abduction, Mohammed's bank card was being used at a B&Q. That B&Q store was in Barrow. His phone pinged off of local cell towers, so he had alibis galore. He'd never even left the country. And on top of this, of course, she claimed that she'd been held against her will at this brothel in Ibiza. But when police mentioned that travel records could be checked, she suddenly decided to recant that claim. How she thought she was going to be able to just pretend to be in a whole nother country for a period of time when in fact she was in the UK is just baffling. She even said at one point that she had been trafficked across the UK by this elusive criminal named Salza. No record has ever been found of this Salza person having ever existed. Now, when Eleanor was confronted with these inconsistencies, she doubled down. She said she had proof. And then she actually provided the police with WhatsApp messages. She showed them Snapchat conversations and also a string of text messages. Each was more damning than the last. Messages from these unknown numbers had threatened for her to stay quiet or else. Other messages did appear to be from alleged abusers, boasting about the assaults and even detailing really horrific acts. It was the kind of evidence that could make or break a case. But when digital forensic analysts analysed these text messages, they discovered the shocking truth. Every single one of them had been linked to Eleanor's own IP address. She'd faked all of these conversations. She created alternate profiles, she'd staged threats even, and she'd fabricated confessions from these people. Ultimately, she'd just been sending messages to herself to support her lies. And then came the moment when the entire case collapsed entirely. This is to do with the injuries, so those photos that I showed you at the beginning, I'll pop them back up here. They're really gruesome images, and they are the things that had done the rounds on social media. They'd really caused national outrage. But a forensic pathologist had looked at those injuries and they determined that they were most likely self-inflicted. And then detectives uncovered CCTV footage of Eleanor at a local Tesco supermarket just days before this abduction, she said, happened. And she was buying a claw hammer. That same hammer was found nearby her when her house was searched, and it was covered in blood. DNA analysis confirmed that the only DNA on it was, of course, Eleanor's. She had beaten herself. She had staged the attack. She had lied. And that is when police decided to look further into Eleanor's background. So they looked into 3 claims that happened in 2019 against this man called Jordan, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, after a night out with Jordan on the 8th and then into the 9th of March 2019, Eleanor alleged that he had taken her to an address, and when they were there, he had raped her. It was 2 months after that she called to report the attack, and she said that the reason she was reporting it now was because Jordan had arrived at her flat again, and after not leaving, he had threatened her with a knife. After that, she said he beat her with a shower head and then raped her. When police were talking to her about this, she showed the police bruises on her legs, and so police did arrest Jordan, and he was eventually bailed. But then, on the 18th of May 2019, Eleanor called police again, this time saying she'd returned to her flat after a night out, and Jordan was there, waiting, and apparently he had entered through this door that she'd left unlocked. She said she left it unlocked for a friend of hers to come in through. She said that Jordan had then hit her in her face, in her body, before raping her. She showed police evidence of these injuries. Jordan was arrested again, and this time he was held in custody until August 2019. I just want to go back to about a month before that, though, to July 2019. Now, at this point, police are suspecting that Eleanor might not be telling the full truth. They think she's lying. So they are building up their case. They're investigating into what's been going on. But then, as they're doing this, they get another allegation from Eleanor. She told them that she was walking through the town centre of Preston, and as she was walking through, she met a man called Ollie or Oliver. She said that Oliver then walked her through to a back street where there were 2 men waiting there, and these 2 men paid him to have sex with her. When she returned to Barrow, Eleanor said she called this man Salza, who I briefly mentioned before, and Salza picked her up in a car and then dropped her off nearby to her house. After this, Eleanor said that Salza and another unidentified man followed her into the address, and then they had sex with her. She said that during this process, she was hit in the face twice. Police managed to track down some CCTV of Eleanor from that night. Now, it shows her getting off a train in Preston, and then the CCTV tracks her, and Oliver is walking on his own at this point. And they have this kind of, I guess, chance encounter. And actually, it's Eleanor asking Ollie for a light for her cigarette. They're seen to talk to one another for a few moments. And once a light is given for the cigarette, Ollie or Oliver appears to walk off. Eleanor's then seen on CCTV appearing to follow him. She wants to continue this conversation. It's quite clear from the footage. Now later, Oliver and Eleanor are seen walking into a kind of alleyway together. Oliver has his arm around her, and it is voluntary. The pair go up this lane out of view. They're laughing, they're chatting, and it's believed that when they were out of view down this alley, they have consensual sex. The pair then swap telephone numbers, and they're seen on CCTV walking back to the railway station, but this time Oliver's gone off on his way and Eleanor's walking to the station completely alone. At Preston railway station, CCTV then tracks Eleanor going into the toilets, and there's this camera at the actual sinks in the toilet. That's how it's reported, so I'm not sure where it is, but either way, it's got some kind of good view of the sinks of the toilet. Now it shows Eleanor doing something to her eye, potentially adding makeup or something else to feign injury. More CCTV footage was then found, and it shows her going back to Barrow train station. We know that she told police that when she got back to Barrow station, these 2 men, Salza and an unidentified man, had collected her before returning her to her address. But when they checked the CCTV, they found her walking alone with no one nearby. Now, by chance, Eleanor's brother's girlfriend drives past Eleanor and notices her. So she stops the car, winds down the window and asks Eleanor if she wants a lift, which she agrees to. So we have CCTV footage of Eleanor being driven back to her house with her sister-in-law or her brother's girlfriend. During that drive back, she didn't see any injuries on Eleanor. And this next bit is, I mean, it's all bizarre, but this is like another level. So bearing in mind, her brother's girlfriend knows, like, she's seen her, she knows she's got no physical injuries, certainly not ones that are visible. And then when she gets home, her brother also sees her. Now, he's aware that Eleanor's listed as a missing vulnerable person at this time, so he calls police to tell them that she's come home. When police arrive to the house, which is only about 20 minutes after they've all arrived there, police discover that Eleanor has significant facial and bodily injuries. But these injuries are new. They weren't there when she arrived home. Her sister-in-law never saw them. Her brother never saw them. So they must have happened within the last 20 minutes when she was alone in her room. With mounting evidence and this really growing public outcry, the police, of course, arrested Eleanor Williams, and they arrested her on charges of perverting the course of justice to begin with. Her extensive fabrications had not only wasted thousands of police hours, but they had also shattered the lives of these innocent people that she'd falsely accused. And it wasn't just the men that she'd accused, but their families as well. Her actions sparked this wave of racial violence across Barrow, further intensifying the chaos. The trial, which took place at Preston Crown Court, saw the prosecution meticulously lay out the web of deceit that Eleanor had woven. It was revealed what we already know, but now the entire court knew. Eleanor had intentionally inflicted her own injuries with a hammer, creating this false narrative of abuse and trafficking. Investigators showed how she had gone to great lengths, even going so far as to kind of make false digital evidence to support her claims. Her allegations were carefully crafted, and they painted a really chilling picture. But under the scrutiny of the court, the truth began to emerge. Throughout the trial, various people, including the men that Eleanor had falsely accused, took the stand. They spoke of the immense emotional and psychological toll of being wrongfully branded as rapists and traffickers. For them, the ordeal was not just about clearing their names. It was about the damage to their reputations, to their families, to their entire lives. One particularly heart-wrenching moment was when a man who had been accused by Eleanor of being part of this trafficking ring, he described the impact that her lies had had on his mental health. He shared how his life had been completely turned upside down. He was facing threats, harassment, public backlash to the nth degree, all based on nothing but Eleanor's fabrications. As the defence attempted to kind of defend her actions, the evidence against Eleanor was just overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a unanimous verdict on all counts of guilty. The judge, clearly shaken by the severity of Eleanor's crimes, sentenced her to 8.5 years in prison. Her actions had caused irreparable harm, not just to the men she accused, but of course to the entire community of Barrow. Now, although Eleanor was sentenced to that amount of time, she actually was released early from prison after serving only 3 years and 5 months. Her early release, of course, sparked further controversy, with many expressing outrage that she wasn't made to serve the full sentence because of the damage that she caused. Unsurprisingly, Eleanor's mainly remained out of the public eye following her prison stint and then release from prison. The reason that I wanted to cover this case was because I think it's such a rare thing that happens, and for the real victims of human trafficking and sexual violence, this case was nothing but a devastating blow, really. Eleanor's hoax made it even harder for survivors to be believed. It's already an uphill struggle, but her lies really perpetuated this dangerous stereotype of false accusers. The damage was done, and Barrow was left to pick up the pieces of a town ripped apart by a single malicious person. I've also done a podcast on the Jussie Smollett case, which kind of is a very different case, but it does have some similar themes. Spoiler alert. Yeah, it's mad. It's really horrific, and I think it's important to cover both those cases because they happened, they're real, and the most tragic thing about them, I think, is how much damage it does to people who are real victims, who are real survivors of these kinds of terrible crimes, be it sexual violence in this case, or racial violence in the Jussie Smollett case. I find them really interesting because, I mean, I can't wrap my head around how people murder people, but how people lie about something like this and go to the point of actually injuring themselves with a hammer, very Gone Girl, is, yeah, also just incredibly baffling. I've missed you guys. I'm sorry that I've not been around so much. YouTube takes so much time to record and edit, and so I'm trying to make videos that are a little bit less time consuming. I hope you guys still enjoy them, and I'm going to try and bring you a few more as well. I'm still uploading on the podcast on Mondays and Thursdays, so if you are missing the content, then you can find it over there. But other than that, I'll keep coming to you, I promise. And if I have any more recommendations, I'll send them over your way. I'm still watching Severance every week, which I'm really loving. I need to talk to someone about that. If you've watched it, let me know if you're up to date. Other than that, I will have a think of some recommendations for next week. I will bring you a video soon, and I will see you very, very soon for the next episode of Red Rum. Bye. Oh, by the way, Red Rum is murder backwards. I don't know if I mentioned this on here. I had a thing on the podcast. I did like a collaboration where I spoke about it, and I had, I'm not joking, over 25 messages, mainly from friends, but from a couple of podcast, like solely podcast listeners, being like, oh, I didn't know that Red Rum was murder backwards. And I was like, oh my goodness, people think that I named my podcast after a horse. It's nothing to do with horses. I don't find horses scary. Horses are nice. I love animals. But it's not named after a horse. It's murder backwards. And also, not my thing, Stephen King. Oh, I feel like maybe I have said this on the podcast, on the video podcast. Anyway, ramble, jangle. I'll see you next week. Bye.